Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to talk about cybersecurity and COVID-19. What should boards be focusing on? And joining me is someone who I've had as a guest before, and I'm welcoming back, is Barbara Berlin, who's the Managing Director of PwC's Governance Insight Center. Welcome, Barbara.
Oh, thanks, TK. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I know that you guys have done a webcast on this topic, and we'll get to that in a second. But I wanted to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted the cybersecurity landscape, and particularly with respect to risk, because there's been so many distractions. It seems like people may have lost sight of their need to keep on top of cybersecurity. So what's your thoughts on that?
So I think, TK, one thing we can say is there's been a significant amount of change over the past 6 months due to the pandemic, whether that's change in companies' business models, where we've seen companies producing new products and services, or even where we've seen industries really transform themselves, where like healthcare has now delivering telehealth services, or we see retail companies now doing concierge services and contactless delivery. I think even broader than that, we've seen where companies' business models are changing in the fact that we're doing a lot of virtual meetings to conduct business. Even you and I today are virtual. So I think that part of the world has changed. And one thing that's really come out of the COVID-19 pandemic is the digital acceleration at companies, the use of new technologies. And I think with that increases cyber risk at organizations. In addition to that, we've seen work from home, where some or most employees are now working from home. They're accessing their networks remotely. They're using personal devices to potentially conduct business. So I think that increases risk. And then on top of that, we've seen a significant rise in phishing schemes. One report that I read said that there's 20 to 30,000 phishing schemes in the U.S. on a daily basis. And so we've seen the very big rise in that area, whether it is threat actors positioning themselves as fictitious banks, fictitious government organizations, charities, even fictitious coworkers. So I think that's another area that certainly has increased during the pandemic. And even ransomware attacks have increased. One report shows that ransomware attacks have increased 800%. So I think all in all, significant change. And I think for companies, what they really need to be thinking about is, how have this change in the threat in the business environment impacted our cyber risk, and how are we managing against that?
Yeah, that all makes sense. So when you think about it, knowing what you just said, and knowing that the cyber landscape has ramped up, because of COVID, what should boards be in their oversight be focusing on, and then subsequently looking into the future with respect to the cyber security?
Well, I think for boards, I guess where I would start is say they want to make certain the cyber strategy is hitting the mark. And what I mean by hitting the mark is making certain that the cyber strategy at the organization is aligned now with this new business environment, with this new threat environment. It's sort of adapting to the changes that I was just talking about. So for boards, they want to be thinking about one, is security enabled in the new technologies that we're using to deliver products and services as the environment has changed, as we're conducting business differently? So I think that's one area. They want to be looking at work from home and whether things like multi-factor authentication or other tools are being used to confirm user access, right? Monitoring the system for user access, proper user access. I think they also want to be making certain that security awareness stays on the minds of employees as we're in this remote environment and as this threat landscape has increased. So how do we continue to communicate and train employees on the cyber environment that we're in today. And then I think when I think about things like ransomware, for companies, they should be talking to the CISO about what is our policy in this area? Do we have a policy? Are we going to pay a ransomware attack if we get one? Or are we not going to pay? And if we are going to pay, how are we going to pay a ransomware attack? So I think those are all questions to be prepared. I think for boards, you really just want to be talking to the CISO about how has our business strategy changed, the environment changed, what are the significant risks to our organizations, and how are we managing those risks. The other big thing that I might say that boards should focus on is, while boards rely heavily on management for their information in this area, as they should in performing their oversight responsibilities, it can be valuable for boards to get insight from third parties and from others. And so what I like to say is, the board should be making sure that they're making room at the table. They're making room to hear from others and get other perspectives on the cybersecurity program. Management may be hiring third parties to perform cyber readiness testing, penetration testing. They might be hiring them to do a facilitation of their crisis management plan. So I think it's important then for boards to periodically hear from these third parties to really understand their findings directly, since these third parties see many different companies, and so they can share what they're seeing and hearing across companies and what their views are on that organization's cybersecurity program. So I think it's important for boards to hear from those organizations, those third parties, periodically, understand their findings, as well as be able to ask their questions directly of the third parties. Those are a couple of areas that I think about, as this environment has changed.
Well, you'd be happy to know when we had Jamie Tass on from Corporate Board Member, and they had just done a recent study about what directors should be focusing on going forward. Cybersecurity ended up in the top two categories. So I think for all of us, that's comforting to know that that has not been sort of pushed aside with all the other distractions. But one of the things that I've experienced, over my career is the number of companies that, while they may be thinking about it, aren't pre-preparing for like a crisis situation. And with the rise in, actual crisis and security breaches, I would think that cyber resiliency would be another pretty important area for boards to be focusing on.
Yeah, TK, one, I agree. I think cybersecurity has to stay on the forefront of, boards' agendas. I'm seeing that in my role, where I see boards still, asking about it and focused on it. Clearly, there's been a lot of other distractions out there, as you mentioned. I think cyber resiliency is a really important topic, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's another area that I think boards really have to be engaged on. And it's one that I have seen boards focus on. But I think as I think about this area, the pandemic, I like to say, boards should be making certain that the company is building a better mousetrap. And so what I mean by that is the company's cyber resiliency plan or cyber incident plan should continue to be improved and continue to evolve. It should be like a living document. And so for boards, what they should be focusing on is not only whether the incident response plan has all of the key elements that, it should have, whether that is, whether that is making certain that the plan has, thought about who the crisis team is, what the triggers are to inform the board, what type of advisors you might need, but also the underlying decisions that can really help a company get back to business as usual. And what I mean by that is, if all the systems are down, which systems are important to bring back first? So decision points like that are important to be thought through, early on. I also think for companies, what I'm seeing now, kind of post-crisis, or while we're still continuing to deal with the pandemic, is taking a pause and looking at the overall crisis response whether it's from the pandemic or another crisis that the company has gone through, to improve those plans. And I think for boards, it's having that candid discussion with management about what really worked in the crisis and what didn't work in the crisis. Do we really have a good crisis plan? Does the board understand that plan? Did we engage with our stakeholders on a timely basis? Were we bold enough in our communications to them? Was the board informed timely? So I think this is a good point where I'm seeing some companies kind of take that step back and look and see whether their crisis plans could be improved. And ultimately, the goal here is to, as I said, continue to improve those plans. So should there be another crisis, should there be a successful breach, the company is in a better position to deal with that. So I think that's another really important area. The fourth one that I would kind of just mention is the importance of ESG. And what I like to say is sort of, opening the blinds, where I think there's a focus on greater transparency by for boards to provide more insight into their activities and overseeing data security and data privacy. So is there additional information that they could disclose, since this is an area of significant focus by institutional investors as well as other stakeholders? And certainly when we're thinking of cybersecurity, data privacy, those areas fall under the S and the G of the ESG. So boards can look at their disclosures. They can even benchmark their disclosures against other companies to see whether they can, open the blinds, share a little more details about what they're doing in their oversight areas. So I think that's probably another area that I would mention.
So I can tell you, as you know, for the last 15 plus years, PwC Center, along with this show, has encouraged and pushed people to do crisis preparation. Okay. And I'm still surprised a little bit, Barbara, in how many companies have not sort of prepared for what's happening. But let's hope that this continued communique is reaching new people all the time. So I was the benefactor of being able to sit in and listen to your webcast the other day. And I think it would be beneficial. Obviously, we've only touched on some of these issues, but you had some, as the facilitator, you had some good guests on who are in the middle of the fray, if you will. And it's certainly something that would be advantageous for our audience to listen to. It was called Cybersecurity Board Actions to Emerge Stronger from the Pandemic. Where can people access this and get an opportunity to see it? Because I'm sure you're offering it to somebody who clicks in.
Yeah, TK, as you said, we just conducted that webcast last week, and I was joined by two of our cyber leaders. So a lot of, I think, great insights they shared as we had a discussion about cybersecurity. The best place to find that is on our PwC Governance Insights Center website. If you go to our website, there's an easy link to replay that webcast.
And we'll make sure we put that up on the screen. So Barbara, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. It's a very important topic. We have to make sure we keep that within the target focus of the board, not be too distracted, although there's plenty of things these days to distract them. But I want to thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me, TK.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.